From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
It is a vote to demand that the humanitarian crisis in Yemen be addressed. It is a vote that will tell the despotic dictatorship in Saudi Arabia that we will no longer be part of their destructive military adventurism.
For the first time in U.S. history, the Senate's voted to advance a bill to withdraw military forces from an unauthorized war using the War Resolutions Act. Could this lead to the end of U.S. support for the Saudi-led bombing of Yemen? That's resulted in one of the worst humanitarian crises. We'll get the latest. Then, as Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman visits Argentina for the G20 summit, Argentine prosecutors are considering prosecuting him for crimes against humanity, including the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. He could be arrested since Argentina's constitution recognizes universal jurisdiction for war crimes and torture. Plus, as global carbon emissions rise for the first time in 4 years, we look at the link between climate change and meat consumption with British writer George Monbiot.
The livestock industry is inherently no more sustainable than the fossil fuel industry. The footprint of the global transport sector is pretty well the same as the footprint of animal agriculture.
George Monbiot became a vegan several years ago. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Senate's voted to advance a resolution ending U.S. involvement in the Saudi war on Yemen. This marks the first time in U.S. history the Senate's voted to advance a bill to withdraw military forces from an unauthorized war using the War Resolutions Act. 14 Republican senators joined Democrats in the 63-37 vote. This is Republican Utah Senator Mike Lee, who co-sponsored the bill.
This is a war of bipartisan creation. A Democratic president has gotten us involved in a civil war in Yemen. We now have a Republican president. That war has continued. It was started, and it has continued, without the involvement of the Congress, without the approval of the Congress, without a declaration of war or an authorization for the use of military force by the Congress. That's not okay.
The Saudi-led war on Yemen has created what the UN calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with 14 million of Yemen's 28 million people on the brink of famine. A recent report by the charity Save the Children estimates 85,000 children under the age of 5 have died from acute malnutrition brought on by the war. Prior to the vote, Defense Secretary James Mattis and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo held a closed-door meeting with senators to defend the U.S. backing of the Saudi war in Yemen. Mattis and Pompeo also briefed senators on the murder of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi last month inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. The officials doubled down on the idea there's no direct evidence tying Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to Khashoggi's murder. This is Defense Secretary Mattis speaking with reporters.
We have no smoking gun that the Crown Prince was involved, not the intelligence community or anyone else. There is no smoking gun.
Have you listened to the tape?
No, I cannot understand that language, but I have spent more than enough time in service of our country. I know what grim circumstances can be. I needed to see what was said, and I read the translations of what is alleged to be the tape. We do not have the tapes. We do not have the tapes. At least I'm not aware that we do.
Secretary Mattis's remarks came one day after National Security Advisor John Bolton also told reporters he did not plan to listen to the tape of Khashoggi's murder because he doesn't understand Arabic. President Trump has also said he won't listen to the tape, calling it a suffering tape. But CIA Director Gina Haspel has heard the tape, but was reportedly blocked by the White House from briefing senators yesterday. The CIA has concluded with high confidence that Crown Prince bin Salman is directly implicated in ordering Khashoggi's murder. A number of senators called out Haspel's absence. South Carolina's Senator Lindsey Graham, a longtime Saudi and Trump ally, said, quote, "This is BS. I want the CIA to come to brief me." He threatened to abstain refrain from any key votes in the Senate until senators receive a CIA briefing on Khashoggi's murder. In more news from the Senate, Republicans have again shut down a vote aimed at protecting Special Counsel Robert Mueller's Russia probe. Republican leadership has repeatedly said such a bill was not necessary and that Mueller's investigation into possible collusion of the Trump campaign with Russian agents during the 2016 presidential elections is not under threat. Meanwhile, President Trump is saying a pardon of his former campaign chair, Paul Manafort, is not, quote, off the table. This comes as Robert Mueller is accusing Manafort of violating his plea agreement by lying to investigators in the Russia probe. The New York Times has also reported lawyers for Manafort briefed the president at the White House about Manafort's cooperation with Mueller's investigators. Some legal experts say this could amount to obstruction of justice or witness tampering. Tensions continue to escalate between Russia and Ukraine after Russia captured 3 Ukrainian ships over the weekend. Ukraine has asked NATO and Germany to send ships to the Sea of Azov. On Monday, Ukraine imposed martial law in parts of the country. Meanwhile, Russia reportedly plans to send more long-range missiles to the region. This is Russian President Vladimir Putin.
There
is obvious evidence of a provocation prepared in advance and devised as a pretext to impose martial law in the country. It has nothing to do with attempts to settle relations between Russia and Ukraine. This game is meant to increase tensions. This is foul play on internal policy in order to suppress political opponents.
A Kremlin spokesperson has said a planned meeting between Putin and President Trump at the G20 summit in Argentina is still set to go on Saturday, after Trump indicated Tuesday he may cancel following Russia's confrontation with Ukraine. Trump's set to arrive in Argentina today. Back in Washington, D.C., the Senate's voted to advance Thomas Farr's nomination for a lifetime federal judgeship in eastern North Carolina. Vice President Mike Pence broke the 50-50 tie after Republican Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona joined Democrats in voting against the former protege of Senator Jesse Helms. Civil rights groups widely condemned the vote. This is Reverend William Barber, who spoke to Democracy Now! Monday about Farr's nomination.
Thomas Farr is connected to white nationalism, connected to Jesse Helms. He's been at the forefront of every racist voter suppression law that's been pushed in this state the last 25 years, and
in other news from Capitol Hill, House Democrats have voted overwhelmingly to nominate Nancy Pelosi to become House Speaker, a position she held from 2007 to 2011. She'll face a full House vote in January. A number of Democrats had called for new leadership, with 32 members withholding their vote for Pelosi, though she ran unopposed. Democrats also voted to return Maryland Congressmember Steny Hoyer to the post of Majority Leader and South Carolina's James Clyburn as House Whip. New York Congressmember Hakeem Jeffries was elected chair of the caucus, beating out Congressmember Barbara Lee of California. Lee said after the vote that sexism and ageism contributed to her loss. In Afghanistan, U.S. airstrikes killed at least 30 civilians in Helmand province, according to reports by local officials and residents Wednesday. At least 16 Taliban fighters were also reportedly killed in the attack. Hours later, a suicide bomber and several gunmen launched a coordinated attack near a British security compound in the capital, Kabul, killing at least 10 and wounding 19. The attacks came as Afghan President Ashraf Ghani spoke at a UN meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, where he outlined plans for peace talks with the Taliban. The number of under- and malnourished people around the world is increasing, due in part to climate change, according to a new UN report on world hunger. Around 11% of the world's population is currently malnourished, and countries that are most exposed to major changes in climate have higher rates of malnutrition. The report also states that the number of extreme climate-related events, such as extreme heat, droughts, floods, and storms, has doubled since the early 90s. In media news, the right-wing TV broadcaster Sinclair Broadcast Group is facing widespread criticism after forcing local news affiliates to run a segment defending the tear gassing of asylum seekers on the U.S. border. The piece was a commentary by Boris Epstein, Sinclair's chief political analyst and former Trump aide.
Dozens of migrants attacked U.S. border enforcement by throwing rocks and bottles. Ultimately, American authorities had to use tear gas to stop the attacks. Some on the left, such as Democrat Congresswoman Maxine Waters, were immediately up in arms about our president and his team standing up for our men and women in uniform and for our national security. The fact of the matter is that this is an attempted invasion of our country.
After the segment caused major public backlash, Sinclair released a statement saying the opinions expressed in the segment do not reflect the views of Sinclair Broadcast Group. The Senate has delayed voting on the nomination of Ron Vitiello to head the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. Vitiello, who currently serves as the acting ICE director, has come under fire for refusing to rule out future family separations at a hearing earlier this month. He's also been called out for a 2012 tweet in which he said the Democratic Party should be renamed, quote, Neo-Clanist Party. This comes as a new report from ProPublica reveals families are still being separated at the border months after the policy was supposedly reversed. A sweeping new report by the Miami Herald lays out how Trump Labor Secretary Alexander Acosta helped billionaire Jeffrey Epstein avoid potential legal repercussions for sexually abusing and trafficking dozens of underage girls. The report reveals Acosta, then a U.S. attorney in Florida, offered Epstein a plea deal in 2008, allowing him to serve just 13 months and avoid a federal trial. The deal put an end to a FBI probe into the case and granted immunity to any of the crime's co-conspirators. It's unknown how many girls Epstein abused overall, though the Miami Herald identifies about 80 women who allege they were sexually abused by Epstein from 2001 to 2006. A survivor of the abuse, Courtney Wild, told the Miami Herald, quote, Jeffrey preyed on girls who were in a bad way, girls who were basically homeless. He went after girls who he thought no one would listen to, and he was right, unquote. Jeffrey Epstein was a wealthy hedge fund manager who was friends with former President Bill Clinton, President Donald Trump, Prince Andrew, and others. In New York, the office of a Jewish professor at Columbia University was vandalized Wednesday with anti-Semitic graffiti. Professor Elizabeth Midlarsky, who researches the Holocaust, said she found large swastikas and the slur Yid spray painted outside her office. This is the latest in a string of anti-Semitic attacks in New York City. Earlier this month, anti-Semitic graffiti prompted the cancellation of an event hosted by Broad City's Alana Glazer at the Union Temple in Brooklyn. In more health news, life expectancy in the United States declined from 2016 to 2017, the third consecutive year a decrease has been observed in a pattern unseen since World War II. The decline is due to an increase in drug overdoses and suicides. A record 70,000 people died from overdoses last year. Drug overdoses linked to the use of fentanyls, highly addictive synthetic opioids, increased more than 45% in 2017. Drug overdoses are the leading cause of death for adults under 55. The European Union's climate chief has announced Europe's aiming for net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and plans to take the global lead in combating climate change.
Going climate neutral will deliver what Europeans want most of all, meaningful improvements to their daily lives. Energy-efficient homes will become the norm in a climate-neutral Europe. Transport will be clean and adapted to a modern, sustainable lifestyle. And today we have to acknowledge that air pollution causes severe diseases and almost 500,000 premature deaths annually in the European Union.
Meanwhile, Brazil has withdrawn from hosting COP25, next year's United Nations Climate Summit. Brazil's president-elect Jair Bolsonaro has been criticized by environmentalists who warn he'll speed catastrophic climate change by opening up vast swaths of the Amazon to agribusiness giants. Democracy Now! Will be broadcasting live from next month's COP24 in Katowice, Poland. And in more environmental news, Greenpeace activists climbed a 600-foot chimney at a power station in central Poland Tuesday to protest Poland's use of coal ahead of the UN Climate Summit next month.
Bełchatów power plant is the largest coal-fired power plant in Europe and one of the largest coal-fired power plant in the world. Greenpeace activists are pointing finger on this particular facility because it's the largest climate killer in Europe. Soon the political leaders will meet in Katowice at the climate summit, COP24, to discuss the future of climate policies. This kind of action should encourage everybody to demand from political and business leaders to do a just transition from coal towards renewable energy and energy efficiency.
Democracy Now! Will be broadcasting from Katowice, Poland from December 10th to December 15th. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. In a bipartisan effort, the Senate voted Wednesday to advance a resolution to end military support for the Saudi-led U.S.-backed war in Yemen.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to change their vote? If not, the yeas are 63, the nays are 37. The motion is agreed to.
This marks the first time in U.S. history the Senate has voted to advance a bill to withdraw military forces from an unauthorized war using the War Resolutions Act. Wednesday's vote sets the stage for a possible final vote on the measure within days. It's seen as a rebuke of President Trump's handling of the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Just hours before the vote, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Defense Secretary Jim Mattis held a closed-door briefing with senators, urging them to vote against the resolution. Administration officials warned senators not to compromise ties with Saudi Arabia over the killing of Khashoggi. They also said U.S. involvement in the war in Yemen is necessary to counter Iran's influence in the Middle East.
The Senate bill is co-sponsored by Vermont Independent Senator Bernie Sanders and Utah Republican Mike Lee. This is Senator Sanders speaking from the Senate floor.
It is a vote to demand that the humanitarian crisis in Yemen be addressed. It is a vote that will tell the despotic dictatorship in Saudi Arabia that we will no longer be part of their destructive military adventurism. And it is a vote, as Senator Lee just mentioned, that says that the United States Senate respects the Constitution of the United States and understands that the issue of war making, of going to war, putting our young men and women's lives at stake, is something determined by the U.S. Congress, not the President of the United States.
Wednesday's vote came after more than 50 prominent figures and former officials, including 2 former U.S. ambassadors to Yemen, signed a letter urging Senators Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer to end America's involvement in the Saudi-led war on Yemen, saying it would, quote, spell the likely end to the broader conflict. The Saudi-led war in Yemen has created what the UN calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with 14 million of Yemen's 28 million people on the brink of famine. A recent report by Save the Children estimates 85,000 children under the age of 5 have died from acute malnutrition brought on by the war. For more, we're joined by Shireen Al-Adimi, a Yemeni scholar, activist, and assistant professor at Michigan State University. She's also one of the signatories on the letter to Senators McConnell and Schumer. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Shireen. Can you start off by talking about how this bill passed? It is historic. Again, it doesn't mean it is moving forward. It simply means that the bill is moving forward, but is highly significant.
Right. So this marks the first really big initial victory that we've seen in this in Congress's related, bills toward ending the war in Yemen. Senator Sanders first introduced this bill in February of this year, and unfortunately it was tabled in March, so they voted not to vote on the bill back in March. And now we're seeing, 8 months later, that finally, there is going to be a debate in the Senate on the U.S.'s supported war in Yemen, and there is going to be a vote, which is substantial. We've never come this far, despite the involvement of the U.S. in this war in Yemen over the past nearly 4 years now. We've never been, so close to having a real debate and a vote in the Senate. So this is significant.
So why do you think, Shireen, what's the difference between what was happening in March and now?
So I think the murder of Khashoggi, unfortunately, has, it's led to this uncovering of this relationship, this toxic relationship between the Saudis and the U.S. unfortunately, these kids in Yemen were dying. They've been dying for almost 4 years now. 85,000 is a conservative estimate of the children who've starved to death. These are children under the age of 5. The number is likely much higher. And when that was the case back in March, when Senator Sanders and Lee and Murphy were arguing these points that the U.S. is involved in this, frankly, genocidal war of Yemen, and there was very little interest in the Senate. We were building interest, but it still wasn't enough to be able to pass this resolution forward, just to be able to debate it in Congress. I think what's changed is that this murder has uncovered this relationship and this really the lengths to which the Saudi Crown Prince would go to achieve his goals, and I think it's off-putting. And for the first time, mainstream media sources were finally covering the war in Yemen and questioning this relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States. So I think that's brought on a lot of negative attention, and now people maybe don't want to be associated with this Crown Prince and his war in Yemen.
I mean, it's very interesting considering what's happening at the United Nations. You have CNN reporting the U.S. slammed the brakes on a UN Security Council resolution on a ceasefire in Yemen, the move reportedly part of Trump administration's fear of compromising his very close relationship with Saudi Arabia. Seems to counter recent statements by both the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, and senior White House officials, including Mattis and Pompeo, who last month called for the ceasefire. And they reported that it was because of the Crown Prince threw a fit that the U.S., slammed on the brakes. But that didn't seem to affect at this point, especially someone like Senator Lindsey Graham, longtime Saudi ally, very close to Trump, who just was infuriated by what happened to Khashoggi and that Gina Haspel wasn't brought to brief them, the person, the head of the CIA, who said with high certainty they believe that Khashoggi was involved with ordering the killing. And now the whole questioning of what Saudi Arabia said about Yemen.
Well, yeah, the Crown Prince and Saudi Arabia have been throwing fits about Yemen for the last 3.5 years. Anytime there's a resolution in the UN, they've been, throwing temper tantrums or threatening to withdraw support for UNESCO and other UN programs. For example, a couple of years ago, when the UN listed Saudi Arabia on the list of child killers, within 72 hours, they were off that list and Ban Ki-moon at the time came forward and said, well, it's because they threatened to withdraw support from other UN programs. So the U.S. has been providing cover for the Saudis in the UN and other European countries as well. Mattis and Pompeo, on the one hand, they say that they want a ceasefire. On the other hand, they're still helping the Saudis in this war. This is not, the U.S. is not a bystander. They're an active member of that war in Yemen, hence the War Powers Resolution that was invoked in the Senate and is now hopefully moving forward toward a vote. And so, we've created this monster. Mohammed bin Salman has been emboldened by his Western allies right from the beginning. As soon as he got power, he began bombing his neighbor to the south, and with full support from first the Obama administration and now the Trump administration, and full support of regional partners as well as European countries who support him with arms and intelligence and refueling and logistical support and training and so on. So I think he's upset now that people are questioning his actions because, frankly, he's been operating with impunity for the last nearly 4 years.
Shireen Al-Adimi, we're going to ask you to stay with us, Yemeni scholar, activist, assistant professor at Michigan State University. We'll go to break, and when we come back, is it possible that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman could be arrested in Argentina because this country recognizes universal jurisdiction, arrested for crimes against humanity and torture? Stay with us. 1 Million Year Trip by Laetitia Sadier. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We turn now to Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's visit to Argentina, where he could face prosecution for alleged complicity in the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi and the Saudi-led humanitarian crisis in Yemen. On Wednesday, an Argentine prosecutor reportedly accepted a request by Human Rights Watch to prosecute the Crown Prince hours after he landed in Argentina ahead of the G20 summit. Argentina recognizes universal jurisdiction for war crimes and torture, which means they are able to press charges against the Crown Prince while he's in their territory. An Argentine judge will now determine if either Saudi Arabia or Yemen have already opened investigations on the prince for possible crimes against humanity. If not, the principle of universal jurisdiction may apply. The Supreme Court of Argentina would then have to decide whether Prince Mohammed is protected by diplomatic immunity, a process that would take longer than the Crown Prince's stay in the country. The G20 begins on Friday. Human Rights Watch Executive Director Kenneth Roth said, quote, "World leaders would do well to think twice before posing for pictures next to someone who may come under investigation for war crimes and torture."
The Crown Prince arrived in Buenos Aires after a trip to Tunisia, where he was met by demonstrators protesting his alleged involvement in the killing of the Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. Khashoggi entered the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey, October 2nd, where he was murdered by Saudi agents. Saudi Arabia has acknowledged the murder, but continues to deny involvement of the Saudi royal family. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia and the United States are reportedly moving toward finalizing a $15 billion arms deal. CNBC is reporting Saudi Arabia signed a letter of acceptance with the United States for Lockheed Martin's THAAD missile system. This comes as criticism is mounting over Saudi Arabia's role in the catastrophic war in Yemen. For more, we go to Barcelona, Spain, where we're joined by Reed Brody, counsel and spokesperson for Human Rights Watch. Still with us, Professor Shireen Al-Adimi, Yemeni scholar, activist, and assistant professor at Michigan State University. Reed Brody, let's begin with you. So explain further exactly what universal jurisdiction is and how it relates to Argentina and the visit of Prince Salman.
Universal jurisdiction is the principle that some crimes are so heinous that the courts of any country can, and in certain cases must, take jurisdiction over them. Universal jurisdiction is international law's response to the spectacle of tyrants and torturers who cover themselves at home with immunity and impunity. It's the principle that led to the arrest, for instance, of Chilean General Augusto Pinochet when he traveled to London. It's the principle under which the former dictator of Chad, Hissène Habré, was prosecuted in Senegal. And the Argentina is one of the countries that best actually incorporates the principle in its constitution and in its laws. Argentina has ratified the International Convention Against Torture and the Geneva Conventions. And both of those conventions say that if someone alleged to have committed war crimes or torture comes into your territory, that you have a duty to submit that case to your competent authorities for the purposes of prosecution.
Well, Reed Brody, why then are people saying that as a head of state, he will be protected by diplomatic immunity?
Well, first of all, he's not a head of state. The head of state is his father.
Right, but he effectively serves as head of state.
Well, that doesn't, but he's not the head of state. And the law on immunities is not totally settled, but the most important pronouncement from the International Court of Justice says that it applies to the head of state, to the head of government, and to the foreign minister. And although he is obviously the power behind the throne, he doesn't hold those positions. Now, it's also possible that the government of Argentina has or could or has given him mission immunity under the there's an international treaty on diplomatic missions. And they would have had to authorize his immunity prior to his arrival. So there are a number of issues in play here that, and as you said earlier, the court has asked the government to inform it on what exactly the Crown Prince's status is.
I wanted to get your response to the various statements of U.S. officials. I mean, you have the director of the CIA, Gina Haspel, who went to Turkey, heard the tape, came back, and now, reportedly, the CIA says they believe that Mohammed bin Salman ordered Jamal Khashoggi's murder. But I want to turn to Defense Secretary James Mattis speaking Wednesday.
We have no smoking gun that the Crown Prince was involved, not the intelligence community or anyone else. There is no smoking gun.
Have you listened to the tape?
No, I cannot understand that language, but I have spent more than enough time in service of our country. I know what grim circumstances can be. I needed to see what was said, and I read the translations of what is alleged to be the tape. We do not have the tapes. We do not have the tapes. At least I'm not aware that we do.
He went on to say that he didn't listen to it because he doesn't speak Arabic. At the White House, National Security Advisor John Bolton told reporters he hasn't heard the tape and would not be listening to it.
No, I haven't listened to it. And I guess I should ask you, why do you think I should? What do you think I'll learn from it?
Well, you're the National Security Advisor. You might have access to that sort of intelligence.
Yeah. How many in this room speak Arabic?
You have access to an interpreter?
Well, you want me to listen to it? What am I going to learn from? I mean, if they were speaking Korean, I wouldn't learn any more from it either.
What would I learn from it, he says, since he doesn't speak Arabic? That's the U.S. National Security Advisor, John Bolton. President Trump also said he won't listen to the tape, calling it a suffering tape. Reed Brody, you've been dealing with international diplomacy for many years in various organizations, most recently for years at Human Rights Watch. Can you respond to what they're saying, that they would not listen to the tape of the murder of Khashoggi? The fact that there even is a tape is quite amazing, but because they don't speak Arabic?
Well, obviously, you learn a lot by even if you don't speak the language from listening to something like that. I think it's kind of obvious.
Well, aren't there translators?
Well, I mean, they have read. I mean, there are transcripts, but obviously those only come to life when you listen, to how these things went down, as they went down. You understand a lot from actually listening to the words. I mean, the information that we all have is quite damning. I mean, the information that is in the public domain, even from that the Turkish authorities have released, is very, very strong. Obviously, you would need to make the link. And in the presentations that we made this week to the Argentine prosecutor, we were only able to give what was in public and what we have. But those are very, very strong. And we were hoping that the Argentine judiciary would take advantage of the Crown Prince's presence in Argentina to ask him the questions about Jamal Khashoggi, about Yemen, about torture in Saudi Arabia that need to be asked.
Well, Reed Brody, it seems striking that these senior U.S. officials, I mean, including the president, would so publicly say that they haven't listened to the tape. Why would they do that? Does that somehow have legal implications that they can claim they never heard what happened?
I don't think it has. I mean, my guess is as good as yours. It seems to me an attempt basically to close their eyes to what is going on. To close their ears, to close their eyes, and to try to avoid the evidence of what has happened here, just as avoiding the evidence of what is happening in Yemen.
And the representative of the U.S. government who has heard the tape, Gina Haspel, is reportedly blocked from going to speak to the senators yesterday as they debated this historic vote that they took. Reed, if you can talk about how universal jurisdiction has been used in other countries, just very quickly. You briefly mentioned them. And particularly being in the country of Argentina, the dirty wars and the history of this place. And do you think that Mohammed bin Salman would have even gone to Argentina if he had the shred of belief that they would arrest him?
Well, certainly one of the main reasons why we filed this complaint in Argentina is it's the first country in a long time that the prince has visited that has a democratic government, an independent judiciary, and that because of its experience with the dirty war has really become a leader in applying international human rights principles. I mean, Argentine courts are actually investigating, under the principle of universal jurisdiction, crimes committed during the Franco regime in Spain, because Spain refuses to prosecute those crimes. I mentioned earlier the Pinochet case, which for Latin Americans is the most important. This was a case where after the transition in Chile, people in Chile wanted to see Pinochet prosecuted. Victims obviously wanted to see him prosecuted. But he had set it up. He had built a wall of impunity for himself in Chile. So it was only possible to file complaints in other countries. And when Pinochet went to the United Kingdom, a Spanish judge, Baltasar Garzón, who was handling those complaints, heard about his presence in London, sent an arrest warrant. The British courts arrested the British police arrested General Pinochet, and in two very famous decisions, when Pinochet challenged his arrest in Britain, the British House of Lords, which at the time was the Supreme Court, said no. The International Convention on Torture says exactly what it means exactly what it says. Either you arrest this person and prosecute him, or you extradite him. And that principle is built in to Argentine law. The Torture Convention has a rank in Argentina equal to the Constitution. So, maybe I assume that the Crown Prince has some very good lawyers, and I don't know what they've told him. But he does face legal jeopardy. It may be that, and it probably will be, that he will leave the country, leave Argentina without being arrested in the next couple of days. But he does face legal jeopardy. And I think this is a warning to him that he may be able to get away with his acts in Saudi Arabia. He may be able to get away with them in Yemen. But when he goes into democratic countries with independent judiciaries that uphold principles of human rights, his immunity may not shield him.
Well, Reed Brody, the Argentine government under Mauricio Macri has suggested more or less that nothing will come of this. How much independence does the judiciary have in Argentina?
Well, it's one of the more independent judiciaries in Latin America, the Supreme Court, which it's not clear yet which court has jurisdiction over this case, and that partly depends on the status that the government says the Crown Prince has. The Supreme Court of Argentina is known for its independence. Obviously, this would be enormous if he were arrested, and it would require, a huge leap by a judge to do this. But we've seen that before. Like, this is what Baltasar Garzón, the Spanish judge, did in the Pinochet case. It's right now the judge already, the prosecutor yesterday said, we have jurisdiction, potentially. We apply the rules of international law and universal jurisdiction. He asked the government, as you mentioned, what the prince's status was. He also asked, are there any procedures going forward in Saudi Arabia and Yemen? Obviously, the answer is no. It's more than likely that this will take more than the 3 days that the prince is going to stay in Buenos Aires.
Finally, Professor Al-Adimi, as a Yemeni scholar, as a person deeply concerned about human rights around the world and in your own country of Yemen, what would it mean to you if Mohammed bin Salman were arrested for crimes against humanity? And even if he isn't, this discussion that has taken place and the vote that took place in the Senate?
I think the discussion is certainly symbolic, and of course an arrest would just be an immense victory to those of us who've been, calling him what he is, which is a war criminal, and he's been a war criminal for the last 4 years since he took power in Saudi Arabia. He has been getting away with starving an entire nation. I'd remind your listeners that this is a war crime under international humanitarian law to block a country from importing, exporting, receiving aid by land, air, and sea. And he's been doing that with the help of the U.S. and UAE and other countries. He's been starving an entire nation. He's bombarding them. People are trapped within the country. He's attacking water plants and food resources. And getting away with it. And so I think an arrest would certainly mean that, there's still some hope left in this world, that, a war criminal would get his just desserts. And I think it's important for us to just be having this conversation. Even, unfortunately, it's taken a very long time for this to get to the level it has at the international sphere, to have this conversation of being the potential of being arrested. He's been traveling for the past 4 years. Nobody really brought these things up before, but I think it's really important. Better late than never, and people are still dying. Kids are still dying in Yemen. A child dies every 10 minutes, so it's urgent, it's important, and I think it sends a strong signal that you really can't get away with this any longer.
Well, I want to thank you, Shireen Al-Adimi, Yemeni scholar, activist, assistant professor at Michigan State University, speaking to us from Michigan, and Reed Brody, counsel for Human Rights Watch, speaking to us from Barcelona, Spain. When we come back, the link between climate change and meat consumption. We'll speak to a leading vegan and columnist, George Monbiot. Stay with us.
Our arrogance and haste may cause our deaths, but who's to blame? 'Cause I'm in dead pain to admit ethics are luxuries. I can't commit to something that's so very far away. And if I cared too much, I'd self-implode. My family rely on me. Don't fret, the problem's nowhere near. Let's focus on the here and now. The future doesn't start today. Will they look back at us and say all they really left behind was pain, not houses, cars, or jewelry? Saw a film the other night, the world was desert killed. But that's okay, 'cause the bake-off has reached its final round. At the pumps, the prices fall.
Someday by Splendid Fred Records. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We end today's show with the link between climate change and meat consumption on the heels of a series of damning reports that say if humans don't act now to halt climate change, the results will be catastrophic. A new study by the World Meteorological Organization shows the past 4 years have been the hottest on record. On Tuesday, the United Nations reported that carbon emissions reached record highs in 2017 and are on the rise for the first time in 4 years. Radical reductions are necessary to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, the level that would prevent the worst effects of catastrophic climate change. The UN reports that economic growth is responsible for last year's rise in emissions and that all G20 countries are not on track to meet their 2030 climate pledges. The UN report comes just days after the United States government released an alarming study saying that the warming climate will increase wildfires, destroy infrastructure, worsen air quality, ruin crops, lead to more frequent disease outbreaks, and could shrink the U.S. economy by as much as 10% by the end of the century. As the world prepares for UN climate talks next month in Katowice, Poland, we turn to the rarely covered devastating impact of meat production on the climate. Livestock from meat and dairy products worldwide is responsible for almost 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions, making it the second largest source of emissions after the fossil fuels industry. Meat and dairy production also uses about 70% of all agricultural land across the world. It's one of the principal causes of biodiversity loss, water pollution, and deforestation.
According to the World Resources Institute, global meat and dairy consumption is likely to increase by nearly 70% by 2050. The resulting agricultural emissions will make it impossible to limit global temperature rise to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius, a target of the 2015 Paris Climate Accord. Our next guest argues the fate of the planet depends on the way we choose to eat. George Monbiot is calling for a new revolution with a global shift to a plant-based diet. The British author and journalist joins us now from Oxford, Britain. George Monbiot is a columnist with The Guardian. His most recent book, Out of the Wreckage, A New Politics for an Age of Crisis. His latest piece for The Guardian is headlined, The Earth is in a Death Spiral. It will take radical action to save us. He's written extensively on the link between animal farming and climate change, has himself switched to a plant-based diet. George Monbiot, welcome back to Democracy Now! So you say the best way to save the planet, drop meat and dairy. Lay out your case.
Well, it's not just that meat and dairy production make a huge contribution to climate breakdown, and I call it climate breakdown because calling it climate change is like calling an invading army unexpected visitors. This is, an existential crisis we face. Not just that, it also contributes to much wider environmental breakdown, the collapse of biodiversity, the destruction of habitats, the destruction of soil and water resources. But it's also that if we stop eating meat and dairy, we have an enormous potential then for sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. Because so much of the land which is currently occupied by livestock would revegetate if those livestock were removed. Trees could grow back, deep vegetation could grow back, and in doing so, they suck CO2 out of the atmosphere and give us the best possible chance we have of preventing climate chaos and breakdown.
Could you explain, George, the amount of agricultural land that's being used to produce food for the livestock and not for human beings, and why you think that's especially injurious to the climate?
It's quite remarkable, really. Livestock account for 83% of our agricultural land use, according to one study, and produce 18% of our diet. It's a huge disproportion. Now, when you look specifically at grazing livestock, which people tend to assume is more environmentally friendly than feeding them on grain, it's completely the opposite. It's the worst possible option. Grazing livestock occupy twice as much land as all the arable and horticultural land put together, yet they provide just over 1% of our diet. It's a fantastically wasteful way of using land. And in order to keep your livestock on that land, you have to exclude most other wildlife. You have to kill the predators. You have to exclude the competitors, the other herbivores, the wild ones. The livestock wipe out most of the trees because they eat the tree seedlings. So the old trees die on their feet and they're not replaced. They wipe out the deep vegetation. They cause a radical simplification of the ecosystem. And as a result of all that, where livestock are grazed, you end up with more or less a wildlife desert, very low carbon holding capacity, lots of damage downstream as well, as soil is eroded, as animal wastes go into the water supply. So doing it with the grazing route is very damaging. Feeding them on grain is also very damaging. The great majority of the soya plantations, which are now devastating South America, wiping out the Gran Chaco dry forests, the Cerrado systems in Brazil, many of the forests around the edges of the Amazon basin, all being destroyed en masse for soya farming. The great majority of that soya goes into animal feed, such that if you want to eat less soya, you should eat soya. The reason being that there's far more soya embedded in a lump of meat that's been produced in indoor agriculture than there is embedded in a lump of tofu.
You're talking about soybeans, of course. I'd like to turn to another perspective on animal farming. This is ecologist Alan Savory talking about the role livestock can play in, well, he says, preserving the environment. He's speaking in a TED Talk.
Only one option left to climatologists and scientists, and that is to do the unthinkable and to use livestock, bunched and moving, as a proxy for former herds and predators and mimic nature. There is no other alternative left to mankind. When I first realized that we had no option as scientists but to use much vilified livestock to address climate change and desertification, I was faced with a real dilemma. How were we to do it? I found there were planning techniques that I could take and adapt to our biological need, and from those I developed what we call holistic management and planned grazing, a planning process. And that does address all of nature's complexity and our social, environmental, economic complexity.
So that's ecologist Alan Savory. Can you respond to Mr. Savory, George Monbiot?
Well, I looked into his claims very carefully because his TED Talk went viral. It's very popular claims. I looked into the science behind them and found there was none. Instead, there were a large number of scientific papers showing that those claims are rubbish. They don't stand up at all. I then interviewed Mr. Savory and asked him to justify his claims. He simply couldn't give me a straight answer to any of my questions. Then there was a major study conducted reviewing 300 papers on this subject to see whether his claims, such as his holistic ranching could suck all the industrial carbon out of the atmosphere, whether that stood up. They found there is simply no evidence for such claims at all, that they are wildly wrong. And unfortunately, those claims, because they're highly attractive to people, because they create the impression that you can eat meat and save the world, are simply not based on fact.
And George Monbiot, can you talk about the fact that we are constantly encouraged to shift from farm-produced meat to free-range meat as a way of making meat consumption both healthier and more sustainable? I mean, bracketing for the moment that most people in the world can't afford it anyway because it's so farm-raised meat is so expensive. You've said that that's just moving from one disaster to the next. Could you explain why you think that farm-raised meat is so problematic?
Well, intensively produced meat, indoor meat, is tremendously cruel to animals. The huge battery hog farms that you have in the United States, the chicken farms, packed into broiler sheds. This is an unbelievable exercise in mass cruelty, in the torture of intelligent, sentient beings. It is an absolute outrage. And so people say, well, let's not do that then. Let's go for free-range meat instead. And that's certainly kinder to the animals, but it's much crueler to the living planet because it's such an inefficient use of land. Free-range meat has a far greater environmental impact even than the very high impact of indoor meat production. Indoor meat production has huge environmental impacts because of the feed used to give to the animals, because of the huge amount of waste that they produce, which then goes into lagoons and floods out of those lagoons and poisons rivers and causes dead zones at sea. But the impact of free-range production is even greater because it requires using such a vast area of the planet to produce so little meat. And across that area, we see the radical simplification of ecosystems, we see the killing of predators, we see fences put up keeping out herbivores, we see trees removed, a complete transformation from rich ecosystems to very poor ones. George, so we're faced with a choice here. If you want to eat meat... sorry, yes?
No,
hello?
You can talk about the choice.
OK, if you want to eat meat, you can have extreme cruelty or extreme environmental destruction. My answer to that, stop eating meat.
So let's talk about your own personal answer and how you changed. I mean, you intellectually knew this before, but would you describe yourself as a vegan?
Yes, I'm very close to being a vegan. I'll eat venison, deer meat, because in Britain, deer are massively overpopulated because we killed all the predators. So it's almost impossible to establish new forests because the deer eat all the seedlings. So we should have fewer deer. We need to cull the deer. And I'm happy to eat the wild deer that are culled. I'll eat roadkill as well because that has no impact. Apart from that is basically 1 egg a month, which I can't quite give up eggs altogether, so I'll eat 1 egg a month. But apart from that, I don't eat farmed animal products at all. And I'll have a very small amount of wild animal products, but that's it.
And how hard was it to make that transition for you?
You know, I thought it was going to be really hard, particularly cheese. I loved cheese. I just thought, how can I ever possibly give up cheese? And something very odd happened. Within about a couple of weeks of giving up cheese, suddenly cheese was just like a lump of lard to me. Why would I eat this? It's just fat. And it's weird, my tastes changed. What I thought I couldn't do, suddenly I couldn't not do. I just don't like cheese anymore. It's a very odd thing that happens in the brain, that you adapt to your diet, you adapt to your circumstances, and suddenly you like what you're now eating and you don't like what you were previously eating. So I thought it was going to be really tough, and it wasn't tough at all. The one difficult thing about it is you have to be able to cook if you're going to have a rich and interesting diet as a vegan. And luckily, in my case, I'm a good cook and I enjoy cooking. But for large numbers of people to take it up who aren't into cooking, we do need a wider range of vegan meals. And that's happening very rapidly in the UK, where now 7% of the population is vegans. That's gone up 7-fold in just 3 years. It's a quite remarkable transformation. There's a massive switch towards veganism here. And the supermarkets and the food manufacturers are responding very quickly to that, making vegan-ready meals. The switch towards plant-based burgers, cultivated meat, cultured meat, making what tastes and looks just like meat out of plant protein, that will massively help as well. And what I really want to see is all that cheap meat which people eat without thinking, the chicken wings and the pork ribs and whatever else it might be, is quickly and rapidly substituted by cultured meat, which has a far, far lower environmental impact and doesn't involve cruelty either.
Well, despite the fact, as you say, George, that there are increasing numbers of vegans in the U.S. remains, it's reportedly meat consumption in the U.S. is 3 times the global average. So could you explain this massive differential? I mean, the U.S. and Europe on the one hand, and the rest of the world, poorer countries where meat consumption is relatively low, and small farmers rely on the animals that they raise for their own nourishment. Would you say the same to them?
Well, what we see is an almost linear relationship between income and meat consumption. In the UK, we eat our body weight in meat every year. In the US, you eat 1.5 times your body weight in meat every year. And the poorest people eat very little meat. They have pretty well a vegan diet. Now, obviously, poor people might want to eat more meat. This is why I think the switch towards cheap cultured meat is an environmental priority. But at present, our massive meat consumption deprives poorer people of their diet, because the grains and the pulses, which should be grown for human beings, are instead grown for livestock, which go into our stomachs. And it's highly inefficient feeding them to livestock first. If you get far more food efficiency out of it if you eat that grain and those pulses directly. At the moment, 50% of the plant protein we grow is fed to livestock rather than to human beings. That pushes up food prices, makes food much more expensive for the poor. If the rest of the world wanted to switch to our levels of meat eating, well, there simply wouldn't be enough food to go round. It's a planetary disaster. There wouldn't be enough soil, there wouldn't be enough water, there wouldn't be enough land. So obviously that's not a sensible way to go. What we need to do in the rich nations is to switch towards a plant-based diet, We have the means to do so, we have the technology to do so, we have the choice to do so.
We have to leave it there, George Monbiot. We want to thank you so much. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.